You are currently the only person in this conference.
Great. Well, my name is Mother Maria de la Revelación, and I'm a servant of the Lord, and I have been asked to give a presentation on the directories of schools, festive oratories, and works of mercy. So we will begin with a prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. Our Lady of Lujan, pray for us. Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. So, I believe you all have the presentation before you. As I said, this is a webinar to give a brief summary on 3 directories of our religious family. The first being schools, our work in schools, our work in the festive oratories that we hold, and our works of mercy around the world. So, as you may all already be familiar with, the religious family of the Incarnate Word aims to make every person like a new incarnation of the Word, as missionaries and Marian. So here are 3 directories. So we'll begin with the first. Our task of evangelization and bringing the mystery of and reality of the Incarnation into schools. The directory begins by quoting our constitutions, which state we want to dedicate ourselves to the evangelization of the culture, to work to effect, through the power of the gospel, mankind's criteria of judgment, values, points of interest, lines of thought, sources of inspiration, models of life, so that the very power of the gospel should permeate thought patterns, standards of judgment, and norms of action. And what a more fertile ground than to be able to do that through the families and through children in schools. So the directory is divided pretty much into 2 sections. One is on the nature, the salvific nature of the mission in the church, and the second is the education in our religious family. So the directory is pretty much broken up into these 2 main points. So in the directory, it's highlighted that the nature and end of education, the word itself comes from 2 Latin words, educere and educare. So the first one is educere, which means to come out, to bring something out of another, to deduce, to infer. And educare, on the other hand, means to teach, to direct, to form, to instruct. to indoctrinate, to develop the moral, intellectual, and physical faculties, guiding them to their state of perfection. And as Catholic Christians, we aim that in education, the aim of education is always subordinated to man's last end, which is union with God. So with which the whole work of education is intimately and necessarily connected. So we always aim into bringing the soul that has been entrusted to us under our care, under our teaching, in different dimensions, to that union with God that they are called to. That's the fullness of the human person. So as I mentioned, the two main sections are the first, the salvific mission of the church, and in that there's subpoints on the task of education in the church, how it must be integral, it must be an integral, holistic education, a supernatural, and one that addresses nature, natural law as well. And the second subsection is what are the principal agents in the task of education? So the family, society, and the Catholic school, and how those agents play a significant part in bringing that soul to the fullness of the human person in all its forms. And then we have the second section, which is this education particularly lived in our religious family, in our institute. And the three main subcategories there are highlighting how the preventative system of Don Bosco is basically our model and guide in our work with young people. Then the next subsection is who are the protagonists in the task of education. Those protagonists, active protagonists, are the educators themselves, the teachers, the families who accompany the children who are being taught, and the students themselves. And finally, how education must be placed into action, both on an intellectual, moral, religious, and social formation. So it must touch all these aspects. Gravissimus Educationis document of the church states, the duty of educating belongs to the church, not merely because she must be recognized as a human society capable of educating, but especially because she has the responsibility of announcing the way of salvation to all men, of communicating the life of Christ to those who believe, and in her unfailing solicitude of assisting men to be able to come to the fullness of this life. That's what we seek to do. As I mentioned, the principal model and guide for our schools will be St. John Bosco and his preventative system. In the directory, it goes into details about what that system entails, but principally, the substance of his teaching is what endures, and the uniqueness of his spirit, his intuitions, his style, and charism are truly inspired in the transcendental teachings of God. So during these difficult times, as they have always been, he continues to be a teacher, displaying a new education, contemporarily creative and true. This education is also richly complemented by other great educators in the church, such as Saint Marcelino Champagnat, Saint John Baptist de La Salle, Saint Maria Mazzarello, Saint Joseph Calasanz, Blessed Enrique de Osso, among others. So principally that concludes and just a brief overview of the work in schools. And now we have the oratories. In the oratories, we have two main sections, the oratory itself, and then the spirit of the oratory. The oratory itself, in it speaks about the nature, importance, and environment, recreation in the system of Don Bosco, and the qualities of those who work in the oratory. So what is the oratory? And then the spirit of the oratory, the place and the times that are given, and the applications provided. Finally, the end of that directory provides a bibliography for those who are engaged in this apostolate. So the oratory was born of the faith and genius of St. Philip Neri, who knew how to combine in a harmonious synthesis the charismatic dimension and full communion with the pastors of the church. In the Rome of his time, he also met the spiritual and material needs of young people with deep wisdom, exemplifying the joyful dimension of faith to the point that he was considered the prophet of Christian joy. This is a discourse of St. John Paul II to the Great General Congress of the Confederation of the Oratory of St. Philip Neri. Philip Neri saw was a great need to provide a healthy and joyful environment to young people in order to develop them both naturally to become better human beings and to be equipped for life, giving them the tools that they need professionally, intellectually, morally, religiously, as well as their spiritual formation, to bringing them into that fullness of the knowledge in the mystery of Christ. So the festive oratory is a religiously fervent and morally healthy atmosphere which involves the youth in their totality in order to guide them with great depth and decision so that they can possess the heavenly life in an atmosphere of religiosity, kindness, joy, freedom, and youthful openness. It is a truly and properly an educational work, having both an individual and a wide-ranging social redemptive efficacy. What Philip Neri saw, what John Bosco saw, were children who were not living a very natural nor supernaturally balanced life. And so they created this religiously fervent and morally healthy atmosphere in order to help them develop to their full capacities as a human being and as a Christian. The first oratory of St. John Bosco in Valdocco was it provided four basic elements. It was a home in which the children and the young people were welcomed and housed. It was a parish in which the gospel was preached. And it was a school accessible to all, especially those who had been turned away in other places. It was also a playground, so a place where joy and friendship was shared among the young people themselves. These are some images of some of our oratories. The top left is in France, top right is in Cyprus, and the bottom, I believe it might be in Italy. So the oratory in itself has no timetable. It should fill the leisure hours of the life of the youth. It should fill the youth with possibilities, with joy, with heavenly and human values, with training and entertainment, with instruction and edification. So it's not just an open playground. It's guided, it's formative, it's ordered, it's disciplined, but yet it's balanced with a freedom that ultimately comes from living in a life of grace. So the goal is always to bring these children into that relationship, that friendship with Jesus, in order that, as St. John Bosco would say, they would run and play and do as much as they like, except never sin. Here are some of our other religious in Kazan and Tanzania. And the directory remarks that joy is essential to the spirit of the oratory. That is ultimately what is attractive to the Christian life. And what Chesterton would always say is the greatest secret of the Christian is joy. Christian life is a preparation for a joyful feast, the heavenly feast. Joy springs from possessing what one loves. He who rejoices in love is the one who truly rejoices. St. John Chrysostom would say, when charity is joyful, there is a feast. And this is ultimately the environment that we want to create for the young people and children. The young people and children that have been entrusted to us in our different missions. So ultimately, the attention to youth, therefore, has a preferential place in the apostolate of our religious families. It's key because we're able to encounter these young people at a very formative age in which they're absorbing many things. Then, depending on the environment that they're in, they can absorb holy and beautiful things that bring them to virtuous living and a more fully human life by developing their intellect and their talents, their gifts. Or it can, if they're not in a healthy environment or an immoral environment, then they're absorbing all the negativity and perpetuating that cycle of evil in our world. So finally, we have the third directory, which is beautiful. It's the directory on the works of mercy. All of them are beautiful, but this one in particular, it's charity very concretely in a way that oftentimes is never repaid by the individual who receives it, maybe in the way that we would hope. Maybe not even in a thank you because they're not able to, but it requires a more supernatural vision of the work to be able to realize that the sacrifices that are endured by the missionaries and the volunteers who engage in this apostolate will ultimately be seen in heaven. And it's a great witness of charity and the faith to those that witness it, not necessarily to those who receive. The introduction to this directory on the works of mercy states that, so we know and believe the love God has for us. God is love, 1 John 4:16. God has loved humanity despite its sinfulness and manifested his mercy to them. Thus, to prolong the incarnation of Christ, a religious family humbly desires by means of works of mercy to reveal to men the merciful love of God and to love God by concrete acts of love to our neighbor. So, to try to reveal this merciful love of God to those who are in need of this mercy, and to be able to show our love to God by these concrete acts of love. The directory is pretty much divided into 3 sections. The main ones being a general overview on the doctrine of mercy. The second one being the works of mercy, particularly lived in our religious family, so both the spiritual and the corporal works of mercy. And then the third are the elements concerning what we refer to as the city of charity. A city that's beyond a physical definition. It encompasses the works of charity that are lived out by our religious and those lay people that collaborate in our mission in the works and the homes. Then there's several appendices. There's some supplementary material that accompanies this directory. Then there are templates or models of rules for the coordination of the specific works of mercy in the city of charity. So I'll go through those. And then lastly, there are common elements to these works of mercy. So the religious community itself, the lay missionary volunteer work, the collaborators, the lay volunteers that many times are with us in these works of mercy around the world that collaborate in a very concrete and real way. And so the directory provides for some guidelines as to how we are to incorporate these lay missionaries into the work that we do in these homes, and the kind of the apostolate that we're able to provide for them. Oftentimes these works of mercy bring us out of our comfort zone, and God is able to teach the soul many beautiful things about himself, about themselves, and about the world around them. And so to be able to accompany those young people and sometimes families that collaborate with us in these homes in order for them to really fully benefit of the graces that God is giving them. The work is sometimes we have lay personnel that collaborate with with our homes, and so there are some guidelines specific to our work with them, our interaction and relationship with them, then the legal and administrative and economy aspects to these homes. This is in our home, the Child Jesus in Bethlehem. The directory states, all works of charity suppose in our neighbor a need, and in us a desire to remedy it under the impulse of the virtue of mercy, which has its origin in the goodness of God. So it's a cooperation with that goodness of God in which the missionary or the layperson working in this home of mercy collaborates or engages. The second part of the encyclical Deus Caritas Est by Pope Benedict XVI ought to be like the Magna Carta for those who do corporal works of mercy in the Church. For the actual work is insufficient if love for our neighbor is not perceived, of love that is fed in an encounter with Christ. So it is ultimately this love, this charity that is the impulse to the work that we do, so that it becomes supernatural and not just merely social work. The works of mercy, both corporal and spiritual, are an ample instrument for the fulfillment of the specific end of the religious family of the Incarnate Word, which is to bring Christ to all humanity, permitting evangelization to take place by means of the testimony of life and by giving possibility to a great movement of adhesion to the doctrine of Christ. The City of Charity of our Institute wishes to be an answer to those most in need, concretized with homes or assisting centers. Its main fields of action are to aid all who are in need, to give an opportunity and formation to volunteers who wish to help, and to teach and to the teaching and defense of the truth. So here on the left, you'll see a couple of pictures of our homes in San Rafael, Argentina, where the first City of Charity took place and was born. A city in a broad sense, because it's several homes, not necessarily adjacent to each other, but pretty much in the very close proximity, with a bunch of religious and lay personnel that staff these homes and work together in order to be able to witness to the love and mercy of Christ to those most in need, and often those most abandoned, those forgotten, ultimately those that Christ lives his life in a very pure and beautiful way. So as I mentioned, some of the appendices, the annexes in this directory highlight five principal works of mercy. The first, our work with the elderly. And it says, our work with the elderly, so whether it's in hospitals or nursing homes under our care, our work with the elderly ought to meet their material needs and bring them closer to a life of grace by means of the sacraments and catechetical instruction. So it's accompany them in their needs in a very real way at the end of life. Our apostolate should also include giving a supernatural vision to the lay personnel assisting the elderly and working with their families, reminding them of their obligation to honor their parents. We have several homes for the elderly around the world, Argentina being one of the main ones, in Spain, in Bethlehem, and several others, and that I'm not coming to my mind right now. But also our work in hospitals, our function in hospitals as part of the apostolate or as medical professionals gives attention to the spiritual needs of the patients and their family members, helping them see the meaning and value of redemptive suffering. It is also important to consider the work with the lay personnel, the doctors and the nurses, and to help them to see their vocation not only in aiding the physically sick, but spiritually sick as well. So in several countries, our sisters work kind of like hospital chaplains in a way, bring communion to the sick, are in the hospitals, are nurses, are doctors, sometimes in the missions. Another home is our work in the homes for abandoned children. So abandoned, orphaned, not cared for properly. So children that need a home, basically, because their parents are either not around or are not able to care for them. So the end of this home is to procure children with any type of moral or familiar problems, family problems, in the state of abandonment or extreme poverty, maintaining them at our home until the situation with their families is resolved, and giving them human as well as religion. The religious will also try to help the parents of the children to overcome the difficulties that lead to the separation of their children. Ultimately, the family should be together. The community of religious in such a home ought to be true mothers, living examples of Mary, the Mother of Heaven. And that, I believe, applies to anybody that works in these homes. Maternal care, paternal care towards the children that are gifted to us by God. Another home is the work that we do with disabled children and youth and sometimes adults in our different homes around the world. This work should be a testimony to all the members of our congregation, to all our brethren in the faith, and to all men and women. The heart of the evangelization of the culture is the charity of Christ, and without it, there is no civilization of love. The religious and any volunteers or collaborators in this task ought to possess as principal qualities much prudence and spiritual maternity, paternity in the manner of caring for these children and youth, fostering their education, human, and spiritual formation. And finally, we have our work in the nursery care centers, daycare centers. In Brazil is one of them. In these homes, particular attention and dedication are given to those children whose families are in great need due to heavy economic difficulties or inability to maintain a permanent well-being for their children. The religious will educate the children in their primordial needs, initiate them in Christian piety, and give them the concrete example of life lived in charity and joy as members of the family of God. They will also work with the parents, helping them better understand the function of the family nucleus and how to foster it. So it's accompanying ultimately the entire family. Ultimately, we want to ask the protection of Our Lady as mother and guide of our religious family to help us to care for those entrusted to our care, to sustain us all in the task of evangelization in its many different facets, different forms, and different structures, and to really pray to intercede for our missionaries around the world. Thank you so much, and I hope this has been beneficial.